Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. We're going to start Little Blue Book number 383, and it is titled Prostitution in the United States by Leo Markham. And let's see what copyright date this one is. Oh, copyright 1928. So this is Prostitution in the United States in 1928. Should be interesting. We have table of contents. Only 3 chapters. First one is historical introduction. So probably the history of prostitution. Second chapter, New York in 1855. And the final chapter, a changing point of view. So let's get right into this one, shall we? Prostitution in the United States, copyright 1928. All right. Prostitution in the United States, historical introduction. First, let's get the cottonmouth out of the way. All right. Prostitution does not flourish under very primitive conditions, and it is a feature of crowded city life rather than a pastoral or agricultural simplicity. It has, however, been called the first profession to arise upon the earth, and there is a story in Genesis which shows that harlots were familiar to the simple shepherds of Palestine, and that a kid was considered a fair fee. I hope that means a baby goat, not an actual child. Although, who knows? Humans are disgusting. In the first North American settlements, there was little prostitution. This is not to say that the pioneers were unusually chaste. We sometimes think of the Puritans as men and women of unmixed godliness. As a matter of fact, the band they put on a long list of harmless amusements tended to make sex the most common form of recreation with them. In the colonies south of New England, the pursuit of joy was not banned, but it took some time between theaters and other amusement places where available. Fornication and adultery were common then in all the provinces. The Puritans dealt more severely with them, finning, flogging, imprisoning, exposing to public shame, or putting to death sexual offenders who were unfortunate enough to be caught. Since they lived in small towns, it was, for a long time, difficult for prostitutes to arise. We know, however, that many women had relations with men to whom they were not married. Private morality cannot, in the nature of things, be appraised statistically, and we do not have any record of the callers the cold Puritan lady received while her husband was out hunting or planting corn. Adulterers were discovered often enough to show that there were many of them. After a time, too, we find special penalties provided for night walkers. Southern colonies were less strict. What the Cavaliers thought of peccadilloes may be inferred from the Restoration comedies of England, while the Puritan attitude is to be found in Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Moreover, social inequality quickly became the rule from New Netherland, or New York, south. The slaves and servants, both black and white, were practically without liberty of choice in sexual matters. The attractive women among them usually became concubines to their masters. The African slaves were brought from savage or barbarous jungle regions and forced to adjust themselves to the whims of white men with strange ways. Their first and chief duty was obedience. As for chastity and reputation, a learned Southern jurist was afterward to declare explicitly that they had no meaning with regard to a negress. A colored man might be married to a woman of his own race, but he had no way of remaining with her if the two were separately sold. The owner could take any of his slave women to himself. If any child was born in this way, it was a slave. The color of the average Negro in the United States has grown much lighter since 1700. Remember, folks, this book was written in 1926, or 28. For white servants, who were mostly slaves over a specified term of years, the conditions were not much different. It was provided by law that a female servant who gave birth to an illegitimate child should be bound to her master for an additional period, and that the child should also be an indentured servant until reaching its majority. Evidently, such legislation was intended to improve public morality and to repay the master for loss of work during and after pregnancy. But it was quickly seen that it made lust profitable. The illegitimate children did not cost very much to raise until they were 5 or 6 years old, when they were put to work. Many masters were therefore encouraged to have relations with their female servants. Frederick Douglass tells of a poor Maryland farmer in the 19th century who could only afford to buy a single slave. He chose a healthy young negress upon whom he depended as a breeder. He was himself a good Christian, which meant that he knew how to embellish his floggings with biblical text, and perhaps too daintily to be with the women himself. He used, however, to lock a white hired man in with a negress. When twins were born of their union, the woman's master was well pleased. The price of a Negro in the middle of the century was far greater than that of a cow or a horse, and slave breeding became an important industry in the northern tier of slave states. Let me read that again. Who could only afford to buy a single slave, he chose a healthy young negress upon whom he depended as a breeder. He was himself a good Christian, which meant that he knew how to embellish his floggings with biblical text, and perhaps too dainty to be with the woman himself. Okay, I thought I read that correctly. Okay. Okay, Northern Tier slave states. Turn the page. Interesting. The negress, who becomes a white man's mistress, does not, except in the most unusual instances, lose caste among her own people. It is better, of course, to be his wife, but this is forbidden in a number of states. In addition to the moral standards imposed on the colored people during the period of slavery, present economic conditions favor laxity. The Negro is excluded from most of the skilled trades, or at least from the unions. He is seldom able to provide a wife and children with even the ordinary comforts of life, let alone the luxuries. Though he be industrious himself, his wife may be reduced to washing clothes and cleaning houses for other people. The attractive young white woman expects to find a husband who is willing and able to support her according to the standards of her parents, or perhaps somewhat higher ones. For the pretty colored girl, this may be a vain hope. Of the early settlers of our country, the French who came to Louisiana were most familiar with legalized prostitution and most tolerant of it. It is true that there were numerous attempts during the early period to suppress the brothels of France, but they were not very successful. The police were authorized, though, to punish prostitutes as such, or because of their disorderly conduct. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many women were exiled to the colonies, especially to Madagascar, to Canada, and to Louisiana and Manon-Lescant. The unfortunate heroine is sent across the Atlantic. Some of the expatriated women became respectable wives, and their children enjoy the aristocracy which inheres in the Creole families. Others resumed their profession in America. Both in the French and English colonies, many of the servants were convicts, exiled after they had served their sentences or permitted to escape the penalties of their crimes on condition that they should go to the New World. Into Georgia they were sent, many debtors and other persons who had made failures of their lives in England. The black sheep was found in all the American provinces, as he is today to be encountered in the colonies and in China. We may reasonably infer, then, that morality was not usually high in America before the Revolution, and though our laws demand something very close to Puritan perfection, delinquency of all sorts is still much commoner than it is in Europe. Delinquents. The emigrant is, in general, more active and energetic and keen than his neighbor who remains at home. Still true. Also, he is less scrupulous, less concerned with the value of tradition and custom and law, more individualistic. America, the land of transplanted people, has been the country of the old Puritans. It is now, to a far greater extent, the home of the new Puritanism. The chief element of these creeds is the consciousness of sin. It is interesting to speculate that this may be widespread in America because sinfulness, according to the usual standards, also is. The charge has been made that the countries where prudery is strongest, especially those where English is spoken, house the most lustful people. In the land of prohibition, it may be said, has more drunkenness than a good many countries whose inhabitants may boldly ask for beer, wine, rum, gin, whiskey, or cognac. The United States is no longer a new country. Only in a few frontier districts and in recently built mining camps do the men greatly outnumber the women. Such a condition, which was long characteristic of the whole continent, encourages promiscuity in its least attractive forms. When a pioneer community gets religion, the sudden ascension of goodness commonly leads to violent measures against harlots and gamblers. Right now, America appears to have surrendered to the Salvation Army and its Baptist and Methodist allies. Perhaps our children receive the reaction, but the country is now given over to the repenters and those persons who are providing themselves with evil deeds to repent later. The example of America has infected Europe too. Our prosperity and efficiency are supposed to be due in part to our puritanical laws. As these are not very well obeyed, it is difficult to see how they have much to do with the matter. Prostitution can be suppressed, or at least reduced to a minimum, but only to the expense of the virtue of the masses of women of the community. This fact, added by the power of money to make law-enforcing officials temporarily blind, explains why our police often neglect to close brothels and to arrest harlots, although the statute obligates them to do so. The same thing is true of some foreign countries, but the United States probably leads the world in the encampment of laws whose chief office it is to make additional work for the government printers. With regard to sexual relations, the legislation varies from state to state. What is illicit under one jurisdiction may be punishable with long imprisonment a few miles away. It may be noticed that fornication is not an offense under American common law or the British common law, and that it is criminal only by an express statutory provision. Prostitution is not authorized by law anywhere in the United States, but the definition, the penalties, and the attitude of the police and the courts are by no means identical everywhere. It is said that solicitation on the streets is a common law offense, and it would be forbidden in any state where the courts accept this view and the common law is still in force, aside from any local legislation against it. For a fuller discussion of the legal conditions with regard to all these offenses, the reader is referred to Little Blue Book number 1148, Sexual Crimes and American Law by Clement Wood. I'll have to see if I have that one. In dealing with prostitution, we must not forget the human needs it serves. It is not merely a blot on an abstract thing called the community, as reformers sometimes appear to assume in their speeches and writings. Perhaps it is not altogether an unmixed evil either, although it is objectionable ethically and hygienically. Benjamin Franklin tells in his autobiography how he wanted to marry a girl of Philadelphia, but required a dowry of about £100, or enough to pay for the remaining debts on his printing machinery. He was refused, perhaps in order that he should elope with his beloved. after which a smaller payment would necessarily content him. But this affair having turned my thoughts to marriage, he says, I looked round me and made overtures of acceptance in other places, but soon found that, the business of a printer being generally thought a poor one, I was not to expect money with a wife, unless with such as one as I should not otherwise think agreeable. In the meantime, this hard-to-be-governed passion of youth hurried me frequently into intrigues with low women that fell in my way, which were attended with some expense and great inconvenience, besides a continual risk to my health by a distemper which, of all things, I dreaded, though by great and good luck I escaped it. I guess that means a venereal disease. Franklin, who was born in 1706, married in 1730. He was not a libertine, but rather a lover of thrift and order, even something of a Puritan. It is curious to find him objecting to the cost of prostitution, for that of supporting a wife was certain to be more. He hoped for a time, as we have seen, though, that his spouse would help him to pay his debts. The distemper which he feared, that is, syphilis, has been the enemy of prostitution everywhere in modern times. A worse foe, surely, than restrictive and prohibitory legislation. I have not introduced Franklin here for the purpose of taking away any of his greatness, for I am certain that many more of our heroes have had relations with prostitutes. Not all men are equally frank, and no one is under any compulsion to inform posterity about his private behavior. Under the list of virtues which he prepared for himself, Franklin included chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Most American action against the prostitute is recent. For many years, no serious attempt was made to abolish or to regulate her profession. The World War caused a great deal of puritanical commotion. The soldier who was going to make the world safe for democracy was first of all to be rendered safe for heaven. Pause for hydration. Cottonmouth. All right, here we go. Next chapter. New York in 1855. When A.J.B. Parent Deutschland published his masterly work about prostitution in Paris in 1836. He inspired a number of other investigators to issue reports about the cities with which they were most familiar. Monographs on prostitution in London, Edinburgh, Lisbon, Lyons, Algiers, and Berlin quickly followed. Dr. William M. Sanger's The History of Prostitution is its extent, causes, and effects throughout the world first appeared in 1859. The most valuable part of Sanger's book is devoted to a study of conditions in New York, which he himself made in 1855. He became resident physician of Blackwell's Island in 1853. 2 years later, the Board of Governors in charge of the charitable and penal institution of the city asked him to make a study of syphilis in the various houses of Blackwell's Island, and to say what plan, in his opinion, could be adopted to relieve New York City of the enormous amount of misery and expense caused by syphilis. Sanger then asked Mayor Wood and the chief and captains of police to help him gather information about prostitution in the city. Prohibitory laws existed, but they were not enforced, although an attempt to put them into effect had been somewhat weakly made shortly before. In Sanger's words, this vice is attaining a position and extent in this community which cannot be viewed without alarm. It has more than kept pace with the growth of our city. Unlike the vice of a few years since, it no longer confines itself to secrecy and darkness, but boldly strides through our most thronged and elegant thoroughfares, and there, in the broad light of the sun, it jostles the pure, the virtuous, and the good. It is in your gay streets and in your quiet, home-like streets. It is in your squares and in your suburban retreats and summer resorts. It is in your theaters, your operas, your hotels. Nay, it is even intruding itself into your private circles, and slowly but steadily extending its poison. Known but to few and entirely unsuspected by the majority of our citizens, the whole machinery of the law has been turned against these females without success, an only result having been a resolve on their part to confront society with the charge of harsh, cruel, and unjust treatment. 2,000 women were asked to answer a number of questions about themselves on the condition which had led them to become prostitutes. In age, they ranged from 15 to 77, the greater part of them being between 18 and 25. 7/8 of the women studied were under 30. Of the older ones, most were keepers of brothels rather than active harlots. Sanger tells us, the marks of emphasis are his own, that the average duration of life among these women does not exceed 4 years from the beginning of their career. I think this was a great exaggeration. As a physician on Blackwell's Island, he was most familiar with the seriously diseased prostitutes. The number of women born abroad, let me make sure I got that, 17, 15, okay, diseased prostitutes, I skipped a page. Did I? Nope, okay, never mind. Diseased prostitutes. The number of women born abroad was 1,238 as compared with 762 born in the United States, 394 of them in the state of New York. It appeared that the native born from other states came chiefly from manufacturing districts. Of the foreign born, 706 had immigrated from Ireland, 255 from Germany, and 104 from England. As to the British dominons, Sanger says the ratio in which the several parts of that kingdom supply the New World with courtesans may be stated in round numbers as follows. Ireland contributes 1 prostitute to every 4,000 of her population. Scotland, 1 prostitute to every 6,000 of population. England and Wales, 1 prostitute to every 50,000 of population. According to the illegitimacy statistics in the British Isles, Ireland was far more chaste than England or Scotland. I have already suggested in writing about concubinage that the Irish figures at home have probably been inaccurate. The young Irish women who were coming to America in large numbers in the middle of the last century were mostly poor and ignorant. The German immigration was also great in the years that followed 1848. Of the foreign women, many had been resident in the country for only a year or two, or even less. Although Sanger does not mention the fact here, it is undoubtedly true that a considerable proportion of the foreign-born prostitutes in New York in the 1850s and for some time later were brought into the country for the purpose of engaging in the traffic. The women said, for the most part, they had come to America to improve their condition or because their relatives were already in the United States or brought them across the Atlantic. Only 1/5 had paid for their own passage or claimed that they had done so. There were 28 who admitted that their seducers had paid for their passage, and 9 whom public authorities had assisted presumably to rid their own countries of undesirable persons. 905 said that they had been helped by relatives and friends. What the basis of the friendship was, the statistics do not disclose. As to their education, 714 claimed to be able to read and write well, and 546 imperfectly, while 219 could not read and 521 were illiterate. The native-born prostitutes were, on the whole, better educated than those of foreign origin. Education was not at this time compulsory in New York. Those who read and wrote well, as Sanger says, meant that they could read a page or two of print without much trouble, and were able to sign their names. There were 1,216 single women, 490 married ones, and 294 widows. It appears that there were no divorcees. Of the married women, 71 were living with their husbands. The others had been deserted by their husbands or had left them because of ill treatment, real or alleged. Of the single women, 30% had one or more children, and the percentages were 73 and 79 in the case of married women and widows. One single woman had borne 10 children, and 2 had given birth to 6 each. One of the married women had borne 15. It is impossible to tell whether the children born out of wedlock were begotten in a period of concubinage or of genuine prostitution. Of the 2,000 courtesans questioned, under Sanger's directions, 821 admitted that they had suffered from gonorrhea, syphilis, or, in 36 instances, from both. The actual number who had been or were venereally diseased was no doubt considerably higher. To the question, what was the cause of your becoming a prostitute? The replies were as follows. Causes: inclination, 513. Destitution, 525. Seduced or abandoned, 258. Drink and the desire to drink, 181. Ill treatment of parents, relatives, or husbands, 164. As an easy life, 124. Bad company, 84. Persuaded by prostitutes, 71. Too idle to work, 29. Violated, 27. Seduced on board emigrant ships, 16. Seduced in immigrant or immigrant boarding houses, 8. With a total of 2,000 prostitutes. It is interesting and important to observe that over a fourth of the number admitted that inclination, not poverty or seduction, had made prostitutes of them. We can be sure that the number was really much greater than this, although we must remember that motives are mixed. The wealthy nymphomaniac may indulge her lust without becoming a courtesan. The young woman who is poor, lustful, and attractive is likely to find in prostitution some sort of satisfaction for her principal wants. Sanger represents the usual tone of the last century, one that has not yet entirely disappeared, when he says, if their representations were borne out by facts, it would make the task of grappling with the vice a most arduous one, and afford very slight grounds to hope for any amelioration. But it is imagined that the circumstances which induced the ruin of most of these who gave the answer will prove that, if a positive inclination to vice was the proximate cause of the fall, it was but the result of other and controlling influences. In itself, such an answer would imply an innate depravity, a want of true womanly feeling which is actually incredible. The force of desire can neither be denied nor disputed, but still in the bosoms of most females that force exists in a slumbering state until aroused by some outside influences. No women can understand its power until some positive cause of excitement exists. But that's what is sufficient to awaken the dormant passion is a question that admits innumerable answers. Acquaintance with the opposite sex, particularly if extended so far as to become a reciprocal affection, will tend to this. So will the companionship of females who have yielded to its power, and so will the excitement of intoxication. But it must be repeated, and most decidedly, that without these or some equally stimulating cause, the full force of desire is seldom known to a virtuous woman. In the male sex, nature has provided a more susceptible organization than in females, apparently with the benefit beneficent design of repressing those evils which must result from mutual appetite equally felt by both. In other words, man is the aggressive animal, so far as desire is involved. Were it otherwise, and the passions of both sexes equal, illegitimacy and prostitution would be far more rife in our midst than at present. Queen Victoria was in her kitchen, eating bread and honey, and the good little girls on both sides of the Atlantic were very, very, very good. Strange to say this, Blackwell's Island physician, who should have seen the truth clearly, chose rather to look at a fairy tale about the lack of sexual desires in virtuous women. We have not yet given up the strange notion that the man invariably seduces the woman, never the woman the man, and that this is due to inherent differences between them. Sanger is altogether misleading when he remarks, "Undoubtedly there are cases where the woman is the seducer, but these are so rare that as to be hardly worth mentioning." Boy, he had no idea. He complains that many obscene books and prints were being sold in New York. Boys and young men may be found loitering at all hours around hotels, steamboat docks, railroad depots, and other places, ostensibly selling newspapers or pamphlets, but secretly offering vile, lecherous publications to those who are likely to be customers. The vendors have a trick which they frequently perform and which can scarcely be regretted. In a small bound volume they insert about half a dozen highly colored obscene plates, which are cut to fit the size of the printed page. Having fixed upon a victim, they cautiously draw his attention to the pictures by rapidly turning over the leaves, but they do not allow him to take the book into his hands, although they give him a good opportunity to note its binding. He never dreams that the plates are loose and feels sure that in buying the book he buys the pictures also. When the price is agreed upon, the salesman hints that as he is being watched, the customer had better turn his back for a moment while taking the money from his pocketbook, and in this interval he slips the plates from between the pages and conceals them. The next moment the parties are again face to face, the price handed over, and the book has been seen before is handed to the purchaser under a renewed caution, and is carefully pocketed. The bookseller leaves, and at the first opportunity the prize is covertly drawn forth to be examined more minutely, and the unwary one finds that he has paid several dollars for some few printed pages without pictures, which would have been dear at as many cents. Bastards. Not all purchasers were so unfortunate. Some were able to get the desired prints, or to obtain books which the police considered indecent. There were, too, voluptuous novels, chiefly translations from the French, with woodcuts which appeared lasciviousness as nearly as possible without being indetectable. Sanger asserts that there can be but one opinion as to the share obscene and voluptuous books have in ruining the character of the young, and they may justly be considered as causes, indirect it may be, of prostitution. Many later writers blame the moving pictures, but in the 1850s the yellow-backed pamphlets were supposed to be at the root of all evil, as though men and women did not make love and kiss and embrace before there were any books. And though adultery and fornication came into existence after there were pageants and plays glorifying sex, are the illiterate more chaste than the literate? I think, rather, that if books and plays and pictures are harmful sexually, it is in substituting incomplete and unsatisfactory gratifications for the proper ones. The reader may try to context himself with descriptions instead of with persons of the opposite sex. The indecent publications reduce illicit intercourse, in all probability, instead of adding to it. But they make small differences of any kind. Of the 2,000 prostitutes whom Sanger's assistants questioned, 302 declared that they had been that they had means of support other than the fees received from patrons, while the rest were dependent on these for their livelihood. Nearly half, or 933, had been servants before becoming courtesans, and the next larger number, 499, claimed to have lived with parents or friends until adopting the calling. The remainder had been engaged in a variety of occupations. One woman said she had been an artist, another had been a hospital nurse. 3 had taught school. A considerable number had been engaged in factories and workshops. The average wage which these women had received was very low, less than $4 a week. The cost of the living was indeed very low in 1855, and many of the girls had lived at home. It was, in most cases, the desire for luxuries rather than the inability to gain simple food and shelter which turned them to prostitution. And strong sexual feeling was surely present in a large part of the cases. For this, we have the testimony of the women themselves, as already noticed. "What business did your father follow?" was one of the questions asked. Farmers led with 440. Next followed laborers with 259, and carpenters with 139. Only one was reported as a brothel keeper. There were 6 clergymen among them, 13 lawyers, 19 physicians, 5 men of property, and 31 naval officers, more than the liquor dealers, who numbered 22. It is clear that the women came from all social classes, and it appears that poor people did not contribute more than their proportionate share. 359 of the girls said that they drank no intoxicating liquors, while 647 declared that they drank moderately. 754 admitted that they were intemperate drinkers, and 240 were willing to describe themselves as habitual drunkards. It is apparent that drinking was very common among the New York prostitutes of the last century. The courtesan is usually addicted to intoxicants, as also to cigarettes, and in many cases to narcotic drugs. Sanger tells us that the quality of the gin, rum, brandy, whiskey, and wine sold in the cheaper brothels was very bad. The religious statistics are as follows. And we'll stop right there. Yeah, we'll stop right there. This is the end of part 1. I lost my train of thought there. Of Little Blue Book number 383, entitled Prostitution in the United States, written by Lee Markham, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.